boxing with Dakota and the big dog. I am the big dog, not Dakota, and he's Dakota. How are you doing? You're on the road game. Love to see a road warrior like yourself doing this. What did you think of Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn? I have some strong opinions, so let's let you set the table.
Well, I guess to set the table, right, when we talked about it earlier in the week, there was a certain expectation of the kind of fight that it could be, and I thought that the fight had the potential to have a lot of holding and a lot of waiting and a lot of tension and not necessarily deliver on the action. And the whole time I was watching it, honestly, what was going through my head was like, yo, this fight has no business being this good. Like it really did exceed my expectations, and maybe my expectations were a little low going in, but it felt like two guys who really put it all on the line. It was a fun action fight. I think they took a lot out of each other, and basically the advantages in size and physicality that I thought that Eubank would have played out as the fight went on, when it was more tactical early, more of a boxing match, and it was about their speed and their other attributes. Benn was having a lot of success, but as the fight wore on and it became more physical, more body to body, Eubank was able to out hustle him and out muscle him and got the decision. And, I'm way more interested in the second one than I ever would have thought I would be.
Yeah, I'm proud to say I was wrong. I did not see this being an interesting fight. I think pretty clearly it's the best fight of the month. I don't think there's been a fight that's more compelling. I think maybe Glanton CBS might be up there for me, but to be honest, when both fights are good, you have to go with the one that was more meaningful and more impactful. And this fight just meant more to more people than that fight, and they were about equally in a similar tier. Thing I couldn't help thinking about, maybe I'll rant about this on my solo pod, or maybe we'll just whatever, is I couldn't help but think Conor Benn was reminding me of Kell Brook fighting Golovkin. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. isn't Golovkin by no means, but it did kind of feel like this performance and this fight was very entertaining, very good. But there's going to be a ceiling to Conor Benn now. There's no longer that expectation of what could he be, what will he be. Now there is a capped expectation. Is that because of a loss? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's more so the move up in weight to me now has done something where he's in a weird limbo and he's in these money fight situations, but not unlike Kell Brook. Kell Brook was a fascinating figure, lose to Golovkin and never was the same guy. I don't think he took the damage like that, but I do think that there is a level of he's never going to be that guy that we have the potential of seeing, okay, this is the best welterweight, this is the best junior middleweight. And I'm not saying he would have been that, but I think that has now left, and now it's kind of, what weight class does he fight at? What is his expectations? What is his trajectory? And that is something that, I thought could be a scenario, but it really, as the fight went on, that's what I started to think about.
Well, and what are the chances of him being able to get back down to welterweight? He looked like he was fit. He was in shape. He definitely looked naturally smaller, but of course, anytime you move up that much in weight, you're moving up 2 weight divisions, it's always going to be a little more complicated to come back down. Now, I could see him having some success at junior middleweight, but he did show a level of hitability. He also showed one hell of a fucking chin that I had no idea he had. Eubank was cracking him time after time, especially down the stretch, and he really hung with him and never really stopped throwing. So he had a chin that I never saw coming, but he takes a lot of punishment. And especially if you can make the fight a little more physical, make it so that it's not an arm's length fight, because he does have good hand speed. He clearly has good power. He hurt Eubank multiple times. But on the inside, in a more physical type fight, especially when he's not the stronger guy the way he would have been at welterweight, he's clearly a little more vulnerable.
Yeah, it just, to me, I never thought I'd say his trajectory now is unclear to me after such a fight. It's kind of strange.
The trajectory is that this is a series, right?
Well, the trajectory is this is going to be the majority of both of their legacies, in my opinion. Is Eubank had this weird somewhat frustrating career of ups and downs, highs and lows, but he endeared himself to some fans. I would say he never took what you'd call a traditional path as a fighter, but he also never really aligned with one promoter. He did what he wanted and moved around and kind of stayed active. We just never knew how far the talent component was. Ben at one point looked like he was the next face of British boxing after Anthony Joshua. Now it looks like he's going to be in a series of matches with Chris Eubank Jr. and how this plays out will then explain where he sits in a weight class. But now he's kind of weight class agnostic. And I never saw that being something where I only see him associated with Eubank Jr. and no other fighter in the near future, not just because of money, but because of just, can you even think of matching him with other guys that are on a traditional career trajectory of a boxer?
Well, in one sense, I think he even gets to fights he's not ready or necessarily deserving of because he's got that big name. So I do think the more this series grows his name, the more options he's going to have, because even if he's not a household name for American fans or people outside of the UK, that fan base travels. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like a George Kambosos, where because he's got that diehard Australian fan base, he's going to keep getting opportunities. They can market, the Teofimo win. And I think that he'll have similar types of opportunities.
For sure. And I guess I was maybe too bullish on him early on, where I was like, this guy might be a guy. He turned his career and whatever. And I think that now I'm looking at him as a contender, not a dominant force, but someone that will maybe test up and comers at a certain point in his career, be in some 50-50 matchups where he's the big name, but there might be a guy who's doesn't have as big a name, but it's a profitable fight. Just it was a weird fight week for me, and maybe it was the British centric nature of it, but I truly didn't really ever care about this fight week.
Well, because all of the British fanfare and Eubank coming out with the dad and all the theater that came with this, we're not attached to that emotionally. Their dads are before my time. Not to say that they're not of significance, but they're not fighters that I watched personally. And I think are probably more ingrained in British boxing culture than boxing culture as a whole. But who's to say that, that Conor Benn doesn't have a Chris Eubank type of career, who I think for all of his flaws has had a type of longevity that I don't think I thought he would have had.
Yeah, it's just a strange career for both, right? Because Eubank, exciting up and comer, won some, lost some, and then just kind of has been since COVID just kind of around.
But he has also fought at a very high level. We talk about when you take tough fights, you lose, right? And I got to give it to him. He has been one of those guys. Like, you look at the list of fighters he's been in with, it's not an unimpressive list, and just because he's not undefeated in those fights, I think it's easy. Maybe it's easier to write that type of a career off when you're the son of a legend. But I think if he had nothing to do with Chris Eubank Sr., you'd look at him as like, yeah, this is just a guy who showed, you know what I mean?
Well, I think it's the pageantry, with the lack of a big win outside of DeGale, who was pretty much done at that point. That's kind of where the question marks exist, because for me, it's like, now with both fighters, not to be cynical, you have to wonder if they weren't the sons of legends and had these paths laid out for them, would they have gotten into this point? And I'm not saying they would or they wouldn't, but that's where my mind starts to go, because it feels like they've had these romats laid out that were pretty advantageous, whereas there's other fighters who are in club circuits or working their way up. Let's say like a guy like a Jermaine Ortiz. Jermaine Ortiz had to really take these hard fights to get to be a notable name across there. And I just wonder if the path was that of a Jermaine Ortiz for these fighters, where would they have been? And that's the cynic in me. And that also kind of dwindles my enthusiasm, because I'm less, a lot of what this was built around was kind of the emotion and the relationships with the previous fighters, and then seeing their sons grow up in the spotlight and get to this point. It was like living a movie or a reality show. And honestly, like, for that type of stuff to consume, I'm just not interested in it. I'm not interested. I watch movies, I read books. That's where I get that stuff. So for me, the the matchup, the fight itself has made me interested in a rematch, but the fight itself and the build up to it, I wasn't drawn to it. But we'll get into these fights coming this week quicker than you guys think. Not as interested in the storylines there either. So maybe I'm just out on storylines, or these storylines seem so, predictable. They're not as like out of the blue. They're very social media-y. It's like, here, this can be shared in a viral clip and people go, oh my God, it's happening. The dad walked in. How is this happening? Like, you can kind of almost see a social media manager sitting somewhere going, this will work good. And I guess maybe it's my experience or whatever. It's just not as fascinating to me. I'm more someone that wants to see some great fights and have the emotion stem from a great matchup.
Well, the good news is they did deliver on that part. So for all of the shit involved in it that I'm not interested, they did give me the part that I am interested in. And again, they both have their flaws. Ben reaches a lot. He's kind of hittable in the pocket. And I think Eubank is kind of a slow starter, and maybe his reflexes are just a touch past where they were at his absolute best. But they did deliver on giving the fans their money's worth in the ring.
Eubank and Ben are both workhorses. They're in great shape, and you can tell they leave it all in the gym. They both have technical flaws, and I think that's what makes the fight good, is that they're both flawed. They're not like these perfect fighters, and they both get emotional at times in the ring. I think the 12th round, when we talk about rounds of the year in 2025, that will be one of those rounds that I look at and go, man, that's up there, because they both were exhausted and they just laid it on the line. And that's really, from a fight fan perspective, that's really when you start punching the air and want to go for a jog after a fight. That's the type of stuff that I think gets everyone excited, especially when guys are making so much money, when guys are willing to risk it at the end of a fight. I think that's when you get that, collective fist pump.
And I also think this was the kind of fight that was going to let us know if one of these guys was a Chavez Jr. or a Camacho Jr., talented, but definitely not, going to live up to the fathers. And I'm not saying these guys are going to live up to the fathers, but I think that they're not under delivering with the ability that they have in the same way that Chavez did.
I'd say their careers have under delivered, but this fight they over delivered. So they made up for everything, because Eubank has been a figure that I've just been confused by. And then all of a sudden, now he's a capital G guy. I could see him in a Canelo fight, honestly, after this type, because it's just the type of fight. Let's just run through this undercard, because I thought it was a pretty good undercard, but it also wasn't an undercard that had me like calling up my mom and everyone I know. I didn't call you up after this undercard and go, dude, what did you think? That's kind of like the sign of a great undercard, is when you and me have the bub phone line going, where you have to call me up or you're texting me how you see in this fight. We had Anthony Yarde-Lyndon Arthur. Not a great fight. I was kind of hoping for Anthony Yarde to kind of stand out a little bit more. Looks like Lyndon Arthur kind of knows how to fight him, and they're always going to be a little neck and neck. Not trying to knock Anthony Yarde, but he's a compelling character, and I was hoping for him to separate a little bit to make that jump. This fight didn't seem like one where he made that jump. He was very neck and neck with Lyndon Arthur. If anything, he might have taken a step back in this fight. I hate to say, that's just an honest observation. Aaron McKenna looked like everything that we had been hoping he would be in middleweight. Dominated a veteran in Billam-Smith and almost stops him in the last round with a body shot. I think Aaron McKenna really moved up into like a promising up-and-comer with this performance, where he treated a veteran as an older fighter. He just was the younger guy that looked like the younger guy in the ring. Vidal Riley really surprised me, beating Chev Clark. Chev Clark mentally looked not focused. It seemed like the floor was really messing with him, and he never seemed locked in. It's weird, because I see so much potential in Chev Clark, and I've seen a lot of people down on him. He's a great inside fighter, but part of what I like about him is his ability to punch with people, make it grueling, and silence me if you don't want me to do the monologue on the undercard. I'm just kind of fitting it all into one concise package, but never seemed like his feet were there. It felt like Riley was very content to kind of pick him off coming in. And my guy Chev, didn't really seem to get creative on the way that he was entering. So it kind of became a methodical exercise for Riley in discipline. Riley's better than I thought. Maybe Chev Clark right now isn't what I thought. Maybe I'll be stubborn and die on the Chev Clark bridge. I still think there's a lot of potential there. I think that when you see a guy mentally consistently doing a lot of things, you have to wonder where his head is in the fight, because it just felt like he was frustrated from whatever was going on. And I don't think you saw it, but the best fight outside of the main event was Chris Billam-Smith versus Brandon Glanton. It was just a classic beat 'em up fight. We knew it was going to be good. Billam-Smith is one of these guys where maybe he's not a Hall of Famer, but he's first ballot Hall of Very Good. Gives you an honest fight. Love that he's not Mr. Trash Talk. He calls himself the gentleman. You know what you're getting. He's a banger.
You want to talk about lineup of guys of your era? I mean, he's really.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy that, like, if he fought in another weight class, I think people would be mentioning him as one of the best of his era. But cruiserweight is one of these divisions where it's like, okay, Usyk, Jay Apataya, Zordo. If you're not one of those three names, then people basically don't regard you as a top cruiserweight, in my opinion, whether right or wrong. And he was in that conversation. That fight was a way too much fun. It was brutal. I still have to worry because CBS took a lot of clean shots in this fight, Dakota.
He always does, though.
I'm wondering with Glanton, though, because Glanton's one of these guys fight him, and then they're never the same after they fight him. If you notice, so I'm like, he won this fight, but I'm wondering about those next performances. Glanton has a way of, like, guys are never the same after they fight him. So that's my summary of the undercard. Why don't you just add to it real quick?
Well, just to add to the Billam-Smith conversation, he's the Zordo fight. He took a tremendous amount of punishment. There's been multiple fights in his career that have been brutal. So with him, as good as he is and explosive as he is, and he beats you, if you're not like absolutely the guy, you're not going to beat him. But at some point he just won't have it anymore because he is getting hit so clean by big punchers. Really impressed with Aaron McKenna. I mean, I think Liam Smith had a hard time pulling the trigger in that first half, but even when he found his moments and hit McKenna with something really clean, he showed the championship chin. He never let it deter him. He never got buzzed, and he looked like an elite level, at least, thinker in the ring for that 12 rounds. And listen, I've always liked Anthony Yarde. I think he's a good fighter. In terms of me putting him in the conversations with the Better Beeves and the Beevols and the David Benavidez, and it just seems like he is just a level below that. And he's probably the best, like, Brit light heavyweight, maybe outside of Callum Smith. But I don't think there's going to be a point at which he catapults up to another level other than where he's at now. And I've always thought Lyndon Arthur was kind of crafty, man. I mean, he got through 12 rounds with Bivol. He might have even won a round. And there was nothing about this fight that was a gimme for Yarde, at least as far as I saw it.
Well, and I agree with you, but I felt like this was supposed to be a statement fight for Yarde. It's a trilogy fight. It's a trilogy no one was calling for. Really show some separation and make a call for a big fight. I felt like after this fight, I now want to see him and Buatsi fight, because that feels like the most interesting, compelling fight for him. And I felt like if he had a great performance, he might have been in the conversation to fight the loser of Better Beef Bivol.
Or maybe Callum Smith. I think that would be another interesting fight, because the fight with Buatsi, it would seem that Smith is the top light heavyweight in the UK at the moment. But I would have to favor Smith in that fight pretty heavily, I would think.
Okay, we're just jumping. There's 3 fights to preview, so we got to go. On Friday, I believe it is. It's Friday, right? Friday, we got Times Square boxing. We got Ryan Garcia versus Rolando Romero. As of right now, we don't know the details on that. We're not even going to talk about that. We don't know what it's going to look like, whatever. They'll make it work. That's their job. Matchup-wise, Ryan Garcia, Rolando Romero. Basically, since Rolly's been a known fighter, has been linked to Ryan Garcia because they had 2 sparring sessions. Romero got the better. They were like 7-8 years ago. And they've kind of both come up around the same era of emerge as social media got more meaningful and mattered more in the world. They both took advantage of social media. I think Rolly was an early adapter at Twitter that used to do the Trolly Awards, where he'd troll people on the internet and give out things. And Ryan has kind of mastered social media. So the matchup, I think, is interesting with two like-minded people happening at welterweight. Main attraction. Ryan Garcia probably on more of an upswing. But I watched the little preview video that they put out today, and Rolly's pretty confident. And I think that this is a dangerous fight, and I'll get your thoughts on it. Rolly's a real puncher, and Ryan, the thing that scares me, right? I think Derek James is a heck of a trainer. He's a real guy. But if Ryan starts doing that thing where he freestyles, he starts doing what he wants to do. When you freestyle with a real puncher and Rolly, see, this is the thing that scares me about this fight, Dakota. Rolly knows that he had hurt Ryan at one point in his life. And I feel like that doesn't go away, that perception of if I land this right hand, if I land this left hook, this guy's going to be hurt. So if Ryan loses focus in this fight could get weird because Rolly has that unquestionable self-belief. Now, I'm sure you're going to push back at me and go, well, Isak Cruz and Gervonta Davis stopped Rolly, and he's never looked kind of the same guy. He's been more tactical. I still think there's something that Rolly might leave it on the line in this fight, and Ryan's coming off of a layoff, albeit, whatever. But I think this fight might be a little bit closer than people think because sparring does matter to me and history with fighters does matter. And I think Rolly enters this fight with a sense of confidence. Am I just trying to talk myself into a good fight, Dakota?
I actually think that will in some ways not serve Rolly because he's going to have this perception of who Ryan is as a fighter, and he's going to be a little more comfortable than maybe he should. And I just see him throwing punches with that chin up in the air, getting whipped with a left hook from Ryan Garcia, and it's lights out. That's just how I see it. I feel like Ryan's got the hand speed, and Rolly has just the right kind of defensive vulnerability to get caught by one of those left hooks from Ryan. He's been much quieter in the build-up to this. It seems like he's almost gone out of his way to not be a public figure in this build-up and to just be a fighter. And so what I would hope and what I would imagine is we're going to see the best version of him. And that's not to count Rolly out. He's certainly in the fight, but I just think when we look at styles and we look at the context of the sparring videos, how old they were, I just think that Ryan's at a different level than he is.
Who's the bigger man, do you think, when they enter the ring?
I mean, that's a good question. Rolly, when I was at the kickoff presser, he was like, when I was at 35, I shouldn't have been at 40. When I was at 40, I should have been at 47. I'm at 47 now. I should be at 54. So it'll be interesting to see how he really fills out. My gut says Ryan, but Rolly, whenever I've seen him, and then it's like I have to remind myself that he's a lightweight. So it will be interesting to see how he fills out.
I think Ryan's more top heavy, but Rolly might be just as big as him. I think people underestimate just how big and dense Rolly is because he always wears baggy clothes and he's kind of a goofy guy. Ryan, I think people saw him go from a string bean to like a real man body. So I think it's like he kind of did the Zac Efron transformation where he's like child actor and then all of a sudden buff guy. And Rolly's never like quite like that, but he's a big dude. I think another X factor for me too, like you said, defense liabilities on both sides. I've been watching the Oscar Duarte fight. I'm really hoping Ryan doesn't implement that shoulder roll. But then against Manuel Jaimez at a certain point didn't really have the ability to punch with Rolly, and Rolly was very content to not take risks and not take chances, which I think would best serve Ryan if Rolly's punch output is very, very limited.
Yeah, the lower his output is, the better it is for Ryan, because even in the Haney fight, you saw the long lulls where he's not throwing a lot of shots. And I'm sure some of that's conditioning and lifestyle and all the things leading up to it. But I do think that's somewhat his mentality as well.
Yeah, you can't change temperament, right? You can't change temperament. And there's a part of him that's an explosive fighter who wants to fight in spurts and load up. It's kind of, I wouldn't say Ryan fights like Canelo, but there's a level where they're similar in the sense that like Canelo's looking for one big shot and then he recharges and he's looking for the big shot and he'll work, but he's recharging. And I feel like Ryan is looking for a big shot and then he recharges and he'll be active, but he's really charging up for that big shot again. And there is a similarity I see there.
100%.
Okay, let's go to Devin Haney versus Jose Ramirez. Why don't you break down this matchup and then I'll add my insight?
Well, this one again is going to be interesting, I think, because they're doing it up at welterweight. I know it's at a catch weight. I believe it's at 144. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. But, you know, Ramirez, a guy been talking about moving up forever. Haney, we've heard, you know, when he was at 140, he'd come and fight in like 165, 170. So, you know, it's two guys that are fighting at a more natural weight that have unanswered questions that of different sorts. With Ramirez, it's what does he have left? And with Haney, it's, you know, are you still the guy that dominated Regis Prograis, that went to Australia and dominated George Kambosos? Are you still that guy, or is the Ryan Garcia fight indicative of what the rest of your career could look like?
So our guy Will in the chat also said Garcia says KO 5 to 8 rounds. I assume he's saying Garcia knocks out Rolly in 5 to 8 rounds.
I think that sounds about right, Will, to be honest.
So let me add to what you said, and I'll interpret what I'm hearing you say, which is all I can do because I don't think for myself, is Devin, to me, has the attributes of fighters we don't typically see in boxing. Like, he could be someone that I think has the athleticism of maybe someone that's in the NFL draft that's a first or second round pick. He has speed that we're not used to seeing. He has strength we're not used to seeing. He has attributes. Normally you see fighters who are coming from a mom and pop gym or slowly getting into a more world class, but they don't necessarily, they're not the most I feel like Devin could get a basketball in his hand and he'll be good at basketball. He could get a football and he'll be above average. Like, he has coordination that doesn't, most boxers, like, you see them play basketball and they're tripping over their feet and stuff, right? Devin has attributes that we don't usually see in a pro boxer, in my opinion. That being said, his no contest to Ryan Garcia, which was originally a loss, but then overturned to a no contest, I think did some mental damage to him. So I'm curious to see how he handles a punch and how he reacts to a punch. And a lot of smart coaches have told me if they were coaching Devin, this would not have been the first choice back. They would have preferred a guy who didn't hit as hard as Ramirez, just because what if something goes wrong, he gets hit and he goes, oh my God, this is happening. So I think there is a fascinating thing to think about. If Ramirez lands a punch, how does Devin mentally and psychologically handle that? That being said, it's hard for me to look at Jose Ramirez and say this is the same guy that was making his title run against Amir Imam. It doesn't look like the same guy in terms of hand speed or closing the distance. The one thing I am concerned, though, is Jose is very underrated in cutting the ring off. He's a hard worker, and Devin has to, and then Devin looks in phenomenal shape, according to his Instagram. Looks in phenomenal shape. But this is a fight where Devin mentally has to have a very boring performance, in my opinion. He has to just stay on the outside, just out quick, out maneuver. If there's chances to sit on shots later in the fight, not that I'm a coach, but maybe pick it up later in the fight, but just don't really give Jose the opportunities to exchange and land. Because if he allows that, and I believe they had a sparring experience back in the day in LA, so I think they've sparred each other, so there's a level of familiarity. But I'm looking to see Devin start slow, use his physical gifts and boxing skills, and not allow the older fighter to get comfortable and get momentum. I think this fight, that's the word, momentum. You want one fighter to dictate the momentum, because if the momentum shifts, it's probably not going to be good for Devin.
I also think, like, you know, if Devin's at his absolute best, in some ways, Jose's style would be tailor-made for him. Like, if this fight had been made pre-Ryan Garcia, I would feel very confident, you know, that he would comfortably outbox Ramirez. Not that it would be an easy fight. I think it'll be probably a harder fight than either of the Kambosos fights. But if Devin Haney is who we think he is, I would think this style is kind of tailor-made for him.
And I think it's going to be a harder fight, even if he wins 100 to 90, mentally, because he's going to have to stay mentally locked in, mentally focused. This is basically going to show us how focused can he be for every minute of every second of every round, because this is going to be a focus and discipline fight. Whereas what makes this fight a little scary for me and a great matchup is Ramirez is playing with house money. He could very, very easily, like, you know, he could very easily get outpointed and go, oh man, I've had a great career. You know, this is a young fighter. It's like nobody's coming in expecting him to have this phenomenal performance outside of his team. And I think that's very dangerous in a veteran fighter. Jose's an Olympian. He's been a world champion. And I think he's also, I think sparring Jose is tricky because I think he's a guy that's better on fight night. So I think you could get a false sense of confidence sparring a guy like Ramirez, where you get in there and his reflexes are a little bit sharper, the punches are a little bit harder. So I think it's interesting. I think the big thing I'm looking at is foot pressure and the way Jose's slipping punches early in the fight. Because really, I think the way he's going to be able to get on the inside is slipping shots and putting pressure, because he's not going to have the speed, the foot speed to probably keep up with Devin. So it's going to be a lot of making him miss, stepping, and making the ring small. And if he's not able to do that, it could be a long night.
Absolutely. I definitely don't think it's a gimme fight for Haney. But again, if I'm thinking about the best version of Devin Haney, I think that this should be a fight he wins comfortably, not easily, but comfortably. And part of why you're matching him with a guy like Jose is to see if he still is that guy. Because traditionally the guys, when you're a smart boxer like that, what's the counter? It's really good hand speed. So Ryan's catching him with shots he doesn't see. Linares caught him with some shots he didn't see. That's the style that's going to give him more issues traditionally. But if he doesn't take a shot the same way, if he's not as sharp as he was a year, 2 years ago, Jose Ramirez is a big puncher and a really physical, smart fighter that's going to give him a hard time.
So it's an interesting fight. Shout out to Average Savage Podcast. They said BDL, that means Big Dog Lukey, not anything else. If anyone was wondering, BDL is Big Dog Lukey. Thank you, Average Savage Podcast. I would compare it to a fight that's also on this undercard, a fighter who had a fight. I would say this fight reminds me of when Arnold Barboza fought Jose Pedraza. That's the level I see this fight, where Pedraza is a very tough guy. It's not an easy fight, but you should be able to win it to show your pedigree, where you're going in the division. Now, Teofimo Lopez versus Arnold Barboza. What do you see in this fight? This is the fight where everyone's saying if there's an upset, this is going to be it.
Well, what would be the upset? Because for me, it's a 50-50 fight that I lean Barboza, because I just feel like I know what I'm getting with him way more than I know what I'm getting with Teofimo. Barboza has traditionally been a pretty reliable guy, other than the fight that was, I think, before his win over Ramirez. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's been a super reliable guy, and Teofimo is the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows. When he looks great, he really does look great, but he's had multiple, I mean, we've said this before, he could have 4 or 5 losses on his record, if the politics of boxing were not in his favor for the majority of his fights. So I lean Barboza pretty heavily on this one. And sometimes I'm surprised that people would consider that an upset.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the way I see this fight is Teofimo has some of those God-gifted traits that make him a difficult matchup, where he has some of those things that you see in superstar boxers: the explosion, the ability to capture the public's imagination with dominant performances early in his career. That said, beyond that, Barboza is kind of the opposite, where he's a guy who started on the club shows. He had to prove that he was a top-tier fighter, worked his way to a world title type fight. That's where he sees himself. So
I think also his momentum has been pretty severely underplayed, beating Ramirez and Catterall back to back. I mean, Catterall coming off the Taylor rematch, to me, was undisputedly a top 5 guy at the weight. And it was a close fight, but Barboza pretty clearly won it. So I just think he has a great momentum behind him. And Teofimo, I don't know that he has momentum behind him. He hasn't fought in a while. I couldn't tell you who the last opponent was. That's how long ago it was. And maybe
I think it was Claggett off the top of my head. I just think
Steve hit him a lot. Steve hit him a lot in that fight.
So to me, there's a lot of things going on here. Like there's a lot of stuff going on in which, of course, let's see, I'm getting text. So can you just cover this, because I have to text somebody? So
yeah. No, I think my point about Barboza having the momentum if you're looking, like, if you're a real boxing guy and you're looking at their last couple of fights, he's clearly the guy who's riding a higher momentum. Of course, Teofimo, more famous, more well-known, more a part of the social media generation and era than Barboza. But if you're just talking pure X's and O's boxing, it just seems like everything would be in Barboza's favor on this one, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean that works.
And by the way, Will Bohemian saying,
my phone doesn't stop texting. So
I'll just answer Will real quick. Then he agree Haney should win comfortably. Good comeback fight for him. I like that he's not taking a soft touch, that he's not taking a gimme, just to get a highlight reel or to look cool or to look dominant, in a way that might not serve him at a higher level. If he don't got it anymore, Jose Ramirez is going to beat him. So he's going to have to be at his best.
Yeah, and laughed my ass off, said average podcast. I don't know, bro. Like, I just feel like Tio has a lot of amazing attributes. He just is not always focused. We don't know what this training camp consisted of. And he's around a lot of influencers, which is a little troubling to me because that's not a lifestyle of a pro athlete consistently. Barboza's in Big Bear training like an athlete. I think the key word, we're going back to themes. This fight is about consistency. Lopez is often inconsistent. He'll have an amazing performance and then a performance that is not consistent. Barboza is consistent in what he brings, but he doesn't have that highest of highs like Teofimo brings at times. So
I also think they want different things out of the sport.
Talk about that, because I think that's a key. I think that I'll set you up for that. I think Barboza is a spiritual opposite, to quote my guy Mike Baca, where like he lives his life with a completely different view of the world than Teofimo. And I think that leads into what they want from the sport being different. But I think that they both look at the other person and look at them as a silly person. Like they think that the way the other person is going about going through boxing is just silly to them. They're so different.
Well, I think the primary difference is I think Barboza's sole concern is being the best and being able to show that he's the best. And he hasn't been able to do that until very recently. And now he's getting those opportunities, and he's a little more vocal than he would have been in the past. Whereas for Teofimo, I think being the best and being great is a part of it, but it's not all of it. I think he's interested in being a personality. I think he's interested in being known just as an individual. I think he's interested in a different type of attention.
Celebrity. He likes the celebrity that comes with being a champion boxer, whereas Barboza, I think, doesn't mind being anonymous and wants to be a champion who other boxers say that's a great fighter. And I think Teofimo likes the celebrity associated with it and likes being a larger than life personality.
And when I look at them too on stage, when I was there, it was just like one guy is very secure and very mature, and the other is neither of those things. And for all of his talent, focus is an attribute. You can have all the hand speed, all the everything, but if you don't have the ability to execute, or you don't have it's the same with basketball. How many guys were incredible scorers, that just didn't have the mentality to do it night after night in certain games. And sometimes I see, Teofimo more in that vein. And because he is a big character and he draws a lot of attention, he gets, I would say, more opportunities than a lot of fighters would.
Okay, we're going to switch over to Saturday's fight, Canelo Alvarez versus William Scull. Canelo gets the chance to be a two-time undisputed super middleweight champion, taking on William Scull. I won't lie to you, I'm not super interested in this fight. Scull barely did the bare minimum to beat Shishkin. It was a real shaky win at that. It probably should be a rematch with Shishkin. He's going into a Canelo fight. My only concerns are Canelo in the past has had some issues with great Cuban fighters like Erislandy Lara or a mover like Caleb Plant. Scull is big, but Scull is very unproven at this level of boxing. If if Canelo has issues with William Scull, I think we start to wonder what does he have left. But if this is the Canelo that went on the run, I think nobody's expecting much more than him kind of just taking over and beating a guy pretty bad.
Listen, if it's the Canelo that fought Munguia, I think he wins and wins pretty dominant. I'll be honest, I'm not real mad at this fight. He's trying to fight for a belt. In theory, if it's a sport, that's what you're supposed to do. He's just fighting the guy that has that belt. Of course, there have been matchups we want to see more. But I think and maybe it's because of the perceived winnability of the fight, but for a guy that would have a ton of options, this is like a very traditional boxing move. So it's tough for me to get mad at it.
No, I'd say it's uninteresting, but it makes sense. And I think the thing I appreciate is it kind of
he could have fought Jake Paul. You know what I mean? But he's going to fight a world champion in his own weight. I would much rather see that.
Well, to me, it shows me where he stacks up against top-rated, up-and-coming champions and guys in the division. Like, if this is a struggle, there's an obvious decline in Canelo. If he handles them, it's like, okay, he's been kind of doing the Canelo thing, but it's been what works best for me. Just not a lot to talk about for this fight for me. It's not a super fascinating matchup.
It's a wait and see. It's a wait
and see. And I think Skull's fight with Shishkin just soured me on him because it wasn't a performance that really had me itching to see him back in the ring if it wasn't against Shishkin, because that really felt like a draw.
I thought he won 4 rounds of that fight.
Yeah, it just didn't really feel like this is a title opportunity fight, and it didn't really feel like he went out there and grabbed and seized the moment. It felt like he kind of did the bare minimum, and it was like he kind of, I don't know. It was not a compelling matchup. That fight lacked the urgency of a title fight to me.
And he's a little closer to like a Rancis Bartholomew than an Arislandi Lara, so I don't see
that's my thought too. Is he kind of has those lulls where he puts himself on ropes and stops punching. So, as I said, if he gives Canelo problems, we're gonna probably have a conversation about where is Canelo really in this division. I think the thing that irritates me is you got a guy named David Benavidez, you got Dimitri Bivol, they got history with Canelo Alvarez. I get setting the table, but it sure would be nice to see one of those type of matchups made fairly shortly with Canelo, given how important he is to the sport.
And is he going to fight at light heavyweight, right? That's always kind of the big question. All the matchups I think that people are more interested in are at 175. And since the Bivol fight, he just hasn't made that jump again.
Well, and I think that like those guys are basically saying they're giving up on it without saying it. Like Benavidez is no longer wanting to stay in super middleweight, and Bivol's saying he'll come down to super middleweight, but Canelo wants to fight him at light heavyweight. So it's the whole thing is frustrating. So we'll go to that. Let's talk undercard. Undercard isn't as stacked as you might want to believe it is. The co-feature, Jaime Munguia, is taking on Bruno Surace. Little bit of backstory. Surace knocked out Munguia, so that's the backstory. The story will be that Bruno is either the guy and he becomes a top player and maybe he fights Canelo in September, or Munguia got knocked out, changes teams, and he's back to where he used to be.
I'll tell you what, though, man, with the kind of knockout it was and the way the fight had been playing out prior, you have to kind of favor Surace at the moment. I know that's crazy, but, you know, it was an upset of the year candidate, if not the upset of the year of 2024. A guy with 4 knockouts knocking out one of the most reliable chins in boxing. So at the moment, you got to at least give the edge to Bruno.
Here's where I stand on this. Munguia has had a lot of fights, and his age doesn't reflect the thing. And what most people don't understand is with those fights comes training camps. With those fights comes sparring. And he's not like what we'd call a defensive wizard. So there is
he's not even like, and he's not even like a Canelo, you know, where Canelo's, I don't know that I would call him a defensive wizard, but
he doesn't get hit clean.
He's a great defensive fighter, and it's a big part of his game that, you know, Munguia just never fully developed in that same way.
Canelo, that's his longevity, is it's hard to hit him clean. And a part of me wonders if Munguia's just taken too many shots, and they're starting to add up, where guys that aren't traditionally power punchers are causing a lot of damage because, he's hitting that thing. And, ages in boxing aren't always the same. Munguia got going pretty early in his career, developed his record. So his age isn't really his boxing age, if that makes sense. I think it's a true 50-50 fight because I think on paper, Munguia should win just based on the power he possesses and his pedigree as a champion in the past. But it's hard to come back from a knockout loss. You're avenging some past demons. And, I wouldn't be shocked if Surace wins this fight and becomes a guy, and Munguia is kind of in limbo. I also think for Munguia, and maybe it happened in the last fight, maybe it could happen in this fight, there's a lot of opportunities if he wins, and he has to stay focused at the goal at hand and not look ahead. And these are the fights that can get very, very tricky because you could start to say, if I win this, I could fight Edgar Berlanga. If I win this, I could fight Diego Pacheco. And really, this is, like you said, a 50-50 fight that defines his career, kind of the way Eubank Jr. defined his career. If Munguia loses this fight, he had a lot of years of uninteresting fights, and people are going to remember this as much as his title reign, I think. So this is a very historically important moment in his career.
And regardless of how many knockouts a guy's got on his record, you give him that full windup to land a full-bodied right hand right on the chin. There's always that chance.
Yeah, so that's there. Our guy, Efe Ajagba, is taking on Martin Bakole. This fight has dramatically changed since February. I think before the February fight where Joseph Parker, let me add some context. Pretend people don't watch boxing and aren't sickos listening to our stream. Daniel Dubois out of a fight with Joseph Parker. Can't remember the reasons. He's out. Sick. Okay. Martin Bakole takes a fight on like a day or two's notice, gets knocked out in 2 rounds by Joseph Parker, looked like a guy who took a fight on a day or two's notice. It had the reputation of being one of the most fearsome, scary boogeymen in boxing after stopping Jared Anderson, then gets pulverized by Joseph Parker. Not sure how he comes back from that. Not sure if money changed his mentality after that. And then you have Efe Ajagba, who's just been taking a lot of really, really hard fights, winning a lot of really hard fights in very kind of boring fashion where fans don't get behind you. He's winning points decisions in very technical battles that I feel like nobody's rallying and saying, I can't wait to see Efe Ajagba in with name this really top heavyweight. This is so closer to a 50-50 fight. And it honestly, to me, feels like these are the type of fights that Uncle Efe Ajagba always seems to win.
I would agree, but in general, it feels like the size and the physicality of Bakole will play into this fight. Ajagba is a hell of a fighter, but Joseph Parker's got hand speed, mobility, and explosiveness that a lot of heavyweights don't have. Most heavyweights don't have. Ajagba a little bit more robotic, and
he's flat-footed and predictable.
Yeah, it's a lot of 1-2. It's a little bit more standard fare than what the diversity that Parker brings to the table. And I just think he's going to be a little more right there for Bakole, but who's to say what that knockout loss took out of him?
The mentality, right? That's what we're going to, the mentality. And did money change him? He's made some money. He's gotten some credit. Anywhere he goes, people go, that's Martin Bakole. I think going into the Anderson fight, he was underappreciated, chip on the shoulder guy. When he gets appreciated, did that change anything? Because he has a style where it's like he needs a haggler approach to boxing. He needs to feel as though people don't respect him. And if any of that desire is gone, I think that he could be in a tough fight because he doesn't have those kind of those elite attributes of like speed, and his attribute is being big, mauling, hitting hard, intimidating. At one point, I thought he was a top 5 heavyweight. I think he's still like top 8. I think Ajagba is number 10. So to me, this is a battle of 2 top heavyweights that basically don't get recognition because of whatever reason.
Yeah, but it is a hell of a matchup. And again, you got to give it to Bakole for stepping in like that last minute. There was no circumstance about that fight and with Parker and the magnitude of it that was ideal. And he was a competitor and he took the fight. So you got to give him credit for that.
Badou Jack, WBC cruiserweight champion. He's taken on Noel Mikaelian, I believe is his name. That's going to be one of the other fights on the undercard. He was originally supposed to fight Ryan Rizicki. Rizicki had injured or couldn't take the fight. Always good to see Badou Jack back in the fight. At the same time, he's fighting a guy who's a lot younger than him and probably a natural cruiserweight, so anything can happen. I'm not going to lie and act like I did any form of research for this fight, but I always enjoy Badou Jack because I think that he was a guy who, during his prime as one of the 10 best fighters in the world, I think he was a pound for pound level talent. Nobody ever acknowledged him as the level of fighter he is. So I kind of view him as a Bernard Hopkins, where he gets to have this little victory lap because no one ever really said how good Badou was, or not enough people said that when he was one of the best fighters.
And also a guy with some longevity. You know, I feel like it had to have at least been a while since he fought last. So I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you clearly, you know, what I think he still brings to the table, but I've yet to see a fight of his where I felt like he looked way worse or like he was in decline. And in a division like cruiserweight, you know, maybe a smart boxer like him, you know, can still make something happen or can at least still be tricky.
So his last fight was a while ago.
That's what I'm saying.
It was February 2023. So he's been out of the ring for 2 years, a little over 2 years. So that's a long time, but that might be good for an old fighter. We don't know. Also, Marco Verde, Mexican Olympian, will be turning pro on this card. He's awesome. So if you like good young fighters, that's someone. Final thing to talk about, Naoya Inoue-Ramon Cardenas. What are your thoughts?
I really like Cardenas, but it's hard for me to picture him giving Inoue a real fight. I'm not saying he won't have his moments. I'm not saying he might not give him some problems. He might even take a round. He's a hell of a fighter. But there's nothing about, he's just really good at everything. There's nothing about him that pops out to me that goes, that's his ticket to beating a guy like Inoue. But he is the mandatory and he earned the fight. And I'm glad that he's getting the fight that he earned.
I also think there's a comparison, and maybe this is a lazy comparison and not quite the same guy. He does have some nary traits, right?
We talked about that after he won the last fight. I think that that's a really solid comparison. Like, I just think that that's two guys that have a lot in common, that have really good technical ability, that sometimes find themselves in knockdown brawls that they don't necessarily need to be in, but that's more so their mentality. Even though they have some skill, they're very similar.
Like, he's probably, like, if Brian Acosta caught him and buzzed him, more than likely Inoue will catch him and probably,
and put him out.
Probably, right? The odds are saying that. But I also feel like the other thing people aren't talking about is Cardenas is probably going to punch with him. And if he lands, he's probably going to drop him the way Neri dropped him. And are these punches adding up on Inoue? We don't know, He's a fantastic fighter, but I always fear with these guys, and I come off as a hater, when guys at the lower weights hit 30. Now, I get sports science and people know more now, but I was always told younger fighters get older quicker. And it's hard for me to not be apprehensive year after year as he gets older and older and he's fighting punchers, to not just at least be a negative Nancy and say, I have some fears about if a punch lands, there's going to be a time where Inoue is in a fight where it could be that way. I'm not saying it's this one, but when you fight,
becomes more likely if he moves up in weight as well. I think that risk is still lower at 122 because he is still essentially fighting guys that are his size. Look at a guy like Ken Shiro, man. He's been taking it right on the chops for almost a decade, and he's still hanging around. I don't think that Inoue's taken a fraction of the punishment he has.
In the chat, they call him the pound for pound Ken Shiro. They call you Ken Shiro hater on a message board, and they got your face there, the Ken Shiro hater in this Dakota's face. He loves to take his shots at Ken Shiro.
I love me some Ken Shiro, bro, but calling him pound for pound is a telling on yourself to me.
I think fighter of the year or fight of the year guy. He's always in a fight of the year.
Totally.
But
we love those guys.
We got on the undercard. We got Rafael Espinoza taking on Kid Vazquez. Sneaky, really good fight. I think it's going to tell us a lot about Espinoza's power and how long he can last in a fight in the second half. Because Vazquez, if he takes the power, we know he's going to be strong in that second half. He gave Ray Ford a tough fight. He gave Joe Cordina tough fight. To me, this is just about the power of Espinoza. If he can handle that power, Vazquez is going to be very live in the second half of this fight, in my opinion.
I think Espinoza's got some real ass power, though, bro. I think that he's a real problem, and I think it's actually only going to get better the more he moves up, should he move up in the future. But I think that power is the real deal, man. I mean, we never seen Robeisy turn around and end the fight, and it was like one good shot broke his eye socket, and that was enough for an Olympian and a hell of a fighter to say no mas.
Are we entering watch the elbows territory with Espinoza, or is that just something that happened after the fight? Should we monitor if he's using elbows or not? Because I remember that was what Robeisy said, and I feel like that's going to be something people bring up fight week.
I mean, sure. And, hopefully if you're the ref and you see it happen, you do something about it. But he also landed a lot of punches. So, he's a long, gangly, kind of bony guy who fights really physical and is always fighting guys shorter than him. So I think that potential always exists. But I wouldn't credit his elbows for his wins over Robeisy.
Feels like the new version of Emmanuel Navarrete just came out of nowhere, and now he's probably going to have a 7 to 10 year run just on the top of cards, picking up belts. It's like you never saw him. I saw him heard him at the press conference doing like a Spanish song. It's like the guy can sing. He can do it all. It's just feels like he's going to be one of these guys that you didn't know who he was, gets a big win, gets another big win. His career kind of mirrors so far Navarrete. Like Navarrete beat Dog Bay twice, who was basically a star at the time or a fringe star, and then has carried that over into a level of stardom where he's at the brink of being one of the bigger name Mexican fighters in the sport in a very short period of time.
And if anything, I think he's more reliable as a fighter than Navarrete. At least he's shown to be so far.
We have a shorter body of work too, so we'll give my guy Navarrete some brink, because there probably would have been a time where you would have been like, this guy Navarrete, he shows that he can box at times against Dog Bay, disciplined, and then you get to see more of the body of work and you go, oh, okay, this is what this guy's bringing. Undercard, we got Rohan Polanco versus Fabian Maidana. Okay, so I'm going to read to you the undercard, and then we're going to wrap this up because we've got an action-packed day in the Lukey household. So Rohan Polanco is taking off Fabian Maidana. If Maidana sounds notable, that's because Marcos Maidana is related to Fabian, but Fabian also fought Mario Barrios, and Mario Barrios is the WBC welterweight champion, so that's an obvious comparison opponent. Rohan Polanco is someone that I think a lot of people are looking at as someone who could make an exciting splash into the welterweight division. I think he's really getting up there to kind of call for a title shot, basically, given how barren the division is. You've got Boots Ennis, you got Barrios, and I think that who's the other champion there? Brian Norman. So maybe Polanco, maybe if Norman can defend his belt against Jun Sasaki, we could get a Rohan Polanco unification, or it's not unification, a title fight, because that would be an interesting contender fight. I think most people are favoring Polanco. If Polanco could stop Maidana, that would be a hell of a statement. We have Emiliano Vargas in a fight on the undercard. He's in some developmental fights. He's moving fine. He's just being developed, because obviously there's a lot to like about him and there's a lot to market there. His father is very famous. He's a good-looking kid and he has talent. Typically, when you have a fighter that can make a lot of money for a company, you're not going to rush them into those fights unless they have a deep amateur pedigree. He does have a deep amateur pedigree, but he doesn't have that Vasyl Lomachenko, Alexander Usyk, Gvozdyk type pedigree, in my opinion. We have Art Barrera Jr.
He's younger than those guys were when he went
younger. It's fine. They're just kind of, they're moving him. It's people act like it's rocket science. These fights used to just be regional attractions. You didn't get a live stream, but now you get access to too many things. So people are it's not like this is the first time it's happened. They're just building a fighter, giving him his experience and getting him to a point. Art Barrera Jr. back again pretty quick. Love that. And Raiz Aleem against Rudy Garcia is a banger of a featherweight fight. Raiz Aleem, to me, kind of wonder if maybe, he could end up fighting Bruce Carrington. If he wins this fight,
dude, I love that fight.
Maybe a belt. There's some form of interim or vacant belt. That's a quality fight. And seeing Rudy Garcia, who's a quality fighter, he's only been lost to top fighters. kind of makes me wonder, given they're in the same weight class, if that could be a potential opponent down the road. I'm obviously not the expert in that stuff. My name's not Bruce Trampler or Brad Goodman, but that's something I'm kind of saying. If you're a big fight fan, maybe watch that fight because it's a pretty good fight. And I think there's consequence that might be a better fight. There might be a fight for that fight down the road. What are your thoughts in particular on Polanco and Raiz Aleem?
I mean, the Aleem and Carrington fight is fantastic, and I think that there's very good chance that Raiz Aleem kind of finds a new place in a second chapter up at featherweight. I thought he looked really good in that last fight. And Carrington needs a higher level opponent to kind of get.
Well, there, just for clarity, in case I confused you, Raiz is not fighting Carrington on this fight card.
No. I understand. I'm talking about the intrigue of that moving forward, because I think that, Raiz lost to Sam Goodman. There was no real like shame in that performance, and it feels like he's still a guy that can deliver some more high quality fights in the future, and Carrington needs those type of opponents. So it'd be interesting to see him. For me, when I think about welterweight prospects, Rohan Polanco is one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting of the moment. Starting to move into contender territory, but still hasn't fought, a certain level of opposition. So it's tough. You don't want to jump to conclusions based on who he's fought. But when I think about promising welterweights in the future of, what was once a money division, I definitely see him as a piece of that.
He's one of the more interesting up-and-comers, but there's been a lot of up-and-comers that look really good up until they get to the point of contention. So I think that, like, for me, he's doing everything you ask of a young fighter. He's not quite getting the hype around him just yet, but he's a really good up-and-comer. I'm very high on him. But, you're only as good as your next fight, and this is his toughest opponent. And if he gets a stoppage here, I think he becomes a top 10 welterweight, in my opinion.
I don't see why not. And on the eye test, he's definitely a top 10 already for me.
Yeah. So, okay, Dakota, you're on the road. I'm about to be on the road. What are you doing this week? How can people support you?
You can always follow me at the Slip and We podcast, ITR Boxing, the Lukey Boxing Show on YouTube, on Instagram. Check out episode 3 of The Fight Life with Jadeja Green. Got a couple of new ones I'm working on right now. Give me a couple weeks. They're coming. And hell of a show, my friend.
Right on. We will see you next week at some point.